Now this is Pavones, one of the best waves on Earth and a break that has been attracting surfers from around the world for decades. But what a lot of people don't know is that Pavones has real interesting and somewhat dark history. It's a history full of discovery, corruption, land disputes, and even murder. And at one point, the wave almost entirely disappeared. So before we dive into the history of Pavones, let me introduce you to the man who put the place on the map in the first place. Now, Dan Foley was a prolific character, a drug smuggler, surfer, and somebody who wanted his own slice of Costa Rican paradise. Now, this story is just as much about Dan Foley as it is about Pavones. So without further ado, let's dive into the history of Pavones. After being tipped off about a potential world-class wave in the south of Costa Rica, Dan Foley chartered a plane with his son and his son's friend in search of just that. They flew from San Jose to the small town of Golfito. Even from the air, they could see whitewater lines peeling from where Pavones is. So at that point, Dan knew that the wave wasn't a fantasy and it was there. Dan instructed the pilot to fly towards Pavones and do a big loop so he could see the wave for himself. As they were flying, not only did they see that the wave was indeed world class, he saw a small farmyard property right on the point. So after that, they went to Golfito and Dan met with local Claudio Lobo. Now, Claudio was the owner of the sawmill farm that was on the point. So after meeting him in Golfito, Claudio took Dan to see the property, and right there on the spot, Dan offered him $30,000. Claudio agreed and the stage was set. Dan had bought the first bit of land right on the point in front of Pavones. And at this point, it's 1974, nobody knew that this wave existed. On the same day that Dan went to check out the property for himself, waist to shoulder high lefts peeled across the point of Pavones, and it was at that point that Dan knew he'd struck gold. By 1982, Dan had acquired basically all of the land in front of Pavones. We're talking a 15-mile stretch along the coast from Punta Banco in the south to a point 15 miles north of Pavones. So the whole entire coastline was owned by Dan, and his Pavones property portfolio eventually consisted of 3,700 acres of Costa Rican land. During this time, Pavones was a tiny place. It had no electricity, no running water, the homes were tiny wooden shacks, there was trash everywhere, no road in or out. So it was a very, very rustic place. And the only way you could access it was by driving to Conte and walking into the jungle, or by taking a boat from Golfito. While at first glance this seems like Dan swept in on a huge land grab with total disregard from the locals, but actually this wasn't the case. While building his Pavones kingdom, Dan employed many of the local villagers to work on his projects. He also helped them build better homes, he removed trash from the area, and he also paved the first road in from Conte. Also, because Dan didn't want to spoil the natural beauty of the area, the trees that he had to cut down to build, he actually shipped in more trees to replace them. He built a medical centre, a school, a church, and the iconic soccer field, which is still to this day the centrepiece of Pavones town. So while Dan did wonders for Pavones in those early days, he wasn't a saint. In 1985, his Pavones kingdom came crashing down. Now, as I said at the start of this video, Danny, among other things, was a drug smuggler. And back home in Orange County, his ranch was raided by the FBI, which was acting as the HQ for a huge international drug smuggling ring. At the ranch, they found thousands of dollars in cash, they found weapons, and they found cocaine. Upon this discovery, the authorities found that this was one of the largest drug smuggling operations in the entirety of North America. So with this, and with Dan facing 30 years in jail, he went on the run. So between 1985 and 1987, Dan was on the run. Now, he had to entirely avoid the US, and even in Costa Rica, with being so well known, he felt the heat. So he had to leave Costa Rica and he fled to Mexico. So he spent 2 years on the run in Mexico, all with this 30-year sentence looming overhead. And while he managed to evade the authorities for nearly 2 years, he was eventually caught in Puerto Escondido in Oaxaca in Mexico's south. So then in 1987, Dan was arrested and did his jail time. Now, at first he went to jail in Mexico, then after a long extradition battle, he was extradited to the US. This left Dan absent and unaccounted for back in Pavones. And this is where things start to get really unique and really interesting in Costa Rica. Whilst he was in jail, Dan put some of his friends in charge of his land. But with many of them losing faith in Dan and essentially turning their backs on him, feeling that he would never set foot back in Costa Rica, they began to divide up and sell parts of his land to other gringos who wanted to come and buy a piece of this Costa Rican paradise, because still at this time there still wasn't that many people coming to Pavones. And that's exactly what happened. Dan's so-called friends began selling off land, and this happened time and time again. So somebody would come down and that piece of land would get sold on, they'd own it for a couple of years, and then that piece of land would get sold on again. So then suddenly you've got all of this land that's been divided up and sold on and on and on. So I just want to interrupt this video to let you know about my new book that has come out today in digital and paperback format. I put my absolute heart and soul into writing and editing it over the last 18 months. I'm super proud of it, and I'm really excited now that it's out in the world. While I appreciate I'm not Will Finnegan and it may not be the most grammatically perfect piece of literature on earth, I absolutely love writing and I absolutely love surfing, so I hope that combination can translate into something that is fun, easy to read. The book details my solo trip through Latin America, so places like Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Peru, Chile, Brazil, many more as well in between. Yeah, the story's full of good waves, lots of bad waves as well, and all the other funny stuff that comes with a year-long surf trip, so I'll leave the link down in the description. But for now, let's crack on with the video. But in 2005, the story gets even more unbelievable. There was rampant unemployment in Golfito. One of the big fruit companies that employed basically 80% of the town pulled out of the area, and it left the majority of people in Golfito without work. So in short, what happened here is that busloads of Ticos, so local Costa Rican people, descended on Pavones, and with Dan absent and unaccounted for, they basically went in and took over all of the land that wasn't being used. Now, to fully understand this, we have to take a look at Costa Rica's homesteading laws, which are very unique. Now, Costa Rican law states that if there is unused land in the country, a squatter can come and occupy that land and actually gain ownership of it within 3 short months, as long as said land is used for business or farming. So Dan owned all of this land in front of Pavones, and it looked like he would never return to Costa Rica, so it was a land grab. So while a lot of this land was unoccupied and squatters just took over, there were parts of it that they tried to take over that gringos did own. This is a period known as the Squatter Wars, and many violent disputes broke out during this time. All of these disputes were over land between Ticos and gringos, and at one point it even resulted in the death of a Tico and an American expat after they both shot each other after an argument over land escalated. At this time, Pavones had a bloody and violent air hanging over it, and it somewhat tarnished the place's reputation as a tropical surfing paradise. However, that didn't put surfers off. In fact, it only made more surfers come because they thought there would be less people. Now, in 2005, Dan was eventually released from jail, and he did make a brief visit back to Pavones and discovered that obviously his land had been taken over, a lot of his friends had turned their backs on him, and his land had been sold off, so he was not welcome back, King of Pavones. During that trip, Dan vowed that he would get his land back, but he was then actually banned from Costa Rica, which made this process tricky, if not impossible. Then in 2006, a proposed project threatened to wipe Pavones off the map, and this was in the form of a tuna farm, so a huge farm that was going to be built a couple of k's off the coast in the Gulf of Dulce, and the proposed project looked to install 10 huge tuna cages, and this would disrupt the whole entire ecosystem of Pavones. And with the currents bringing water from the tuna farm toward the coast, it would basically cover Pavones in tuna shit, essentially ruin the wave. Now, I won't get too deep into the whole tuna farm debacle. There's actually a really good book that I read last week whilst I was researching this video that dives into the whole thing. It's a really interesting book. The research that's gone into it is absolutely amazing. It's called The Battle for Paradise, so I'll leave the link to it down in the description if you want to dive deeper into that story. But in short, the evidence that the project needed to get the go-ahead from the government was fabricated, and the construction of the project was approved under really conspicuous circumstances, and none of the locals in Pavones were told about the project. But eventually the local community, in conjunction with surf-related environmental organisations such as Save the Waves, fought against the project. It was a 6-year-long legal battle to prevent this tuna farm, but eventually surfers won and the tuna farm project was no longer. And that leaves us where we are today. So Pavones, thanks to the work of those organisations and the community around Pavones, is still the pristine paradise we all know and love. Granted, it's super busy nowadays. There's a lot of people surfing, you know, everyone wants a slice of it. And when you go there, now you know a little bit about the history, it gives you like an increased sense of appreciation for the place. So what actually happened to Dan Foley? Dan was banned from Costa Rica, and the community of Pavones had long since turned their backs on him. After being released from jail in America, he moved back to Mexico and resided in Cabo San Lucas in Baja. During this time, Dan's lawyers submitted over 60 cases to try and get his land back in Costa Rica, and only one of them was successful. So Dan was never able to reclaim his land. And that is kind of where our story ends. Now, Dan was well into his 80s at this point. If you guys have any more information on this, I'd love to hear it, because the book and the research that I've done kind of just ends there. But yeah, that is the history of Pavones. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope you found it really informative and entertaining. Any more info that you can add to this story, please throw it down in the comments. I'd love to hear it. But for now, it's goodbye from me, and I'll see you in the next episode.